The Behind the Buy podcast features audio stories told by members of the federal acquisition workforce who have successfully executed best practice IT contracting strategies from the TechFAR and Digital Services Playbook to help their agency meet its mission.
Hello, I'm Ann Rung, Administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and today for the administration's Behind the Buy audio series, we'll hear from a rare talent, someone who has both a legal and technical background to talk to us about structuring budgets and contracts to support delivery. Dave Svenich is the Director of Acquisition Management for 18F Consulting, which is an office within GSA that helps agencies think through complex IT services and procurements. He was formerly the General Counsel to the Council of the District of Columbia, and he's an accomplished full-stack developer. And Dave, you're going to have to tell me what that means exactly.
Sure.
So welcome to today's podcast, Dave.
Great, thanks for having me.
So first of all, what is a full-stack developer?
So a full-stack developer works on the front end and back end. I do systems administration. I can work on front-end websites, basically everything that you can imagine with the digital services space.
So how did a lawyer become a developer?
Right, so my start was actually at a hackathon. I was invited to a hackathon in town. There are a bunch of really excellent civic, they call themselves civic hackers, and they're developers and people who are trying to improve the community in which they live. And I was invited to one of these hackathons, and it was an incredible experience, and I decided at that moment I wanted to know what they were doing and how to do it, and that set me off on a personal journey to learn how to code.
And you taught yourself, basically.
I did, yeah.
That's impressive. And then what brought you to 18F Consulting?
Really the opportunity to work on software development, digital services, and changing how we buy digital services in the federal space.
Would you say you use your legal skills more or your development skills more?
I think I probably use a combination, and also just my experience within working within government. I spent 8 years in local government in this space, and so I use that more than I use either my legal skills or my development skills.
Well, since I worked in state government, I'm biased, and I think people with state and local government experience have real hands-on
That's been my experience.
So let's just jump right in, Dave. So tell me, how do we improve our chances of acquisition success for development work? What kind of strategies work best?
Right. So I guess the first thing to realize is that procurement, and especially procurement of software development, is all about managing risk. Mm-hmm. To mitigate risk in software development, we can use strategies that have proven to work well, and some of the ones that we promote at 18F Consulting are to use Agile, to use incremental and modular contracting, to use open source, and where appropriate to prototype before you go to market. These strategies have proven success over time, and that's what we recommend using.
Now, how can using the TechFAR handbook help an agency implement some of these strategies?
Right, the main thing, and it's not just for agency counsel, is that the FAR actually allows for these things. It allows for agile development. It's really permission to do the things the right way.
So the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, have a number of provisions. It's a very large document, but the point is that it allows you to do a lot.
Exactly.
And the TechFAR kind of highlights where in those regulations it says that you can use some of these innovative or agile approaches.
We call this defutting, removes fear, uncertainty, and doubt in this space.
I've never heard that. That's a good one.
Yep.
That's a good one for government. So can you briefly describe why the team approach is so important in agile acquisitions?
Sure. It's a two-way street, right? So you need to have you need to break away from the idea of SOV types and silos, the idea that program offices and contracting offices and legal offices and the technical shops all sit separately and don't really communicate to each other, because so much is lost when they're not sitting in the same room and talking to each other. So getting everyone on the same page, making sure that they're discussing their needs in sort of a structured way and focusing on the vision is really, really essential.
Right, I hear people talk about how it's kind of the tossing it over the fence approach, and you move it on to the next office. And I think a lot of our contracting officers feel like even though it really is a team, they're the ones that are sort of left holding the bag if something goes wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's really about making sure that there's a shared sense of mission.
So another thing I hear from industry quite often, and I've talked about this in some of the other podcasts, is that a lot of our requirements are describing what it is we want to buy are overly prescriptive, too long, too government specific. So how can you really do this in the Agile space in what is probably, you would say, is the right way?
Sure. So it's actually a really, really difficult question to answer because in a sense, Agile is an exercise in humility, right? So we know that we don't know everything. We know that we'll have a better understanding of what we'll need as we get further down the process. We know that the requirements may change.
Is the point that you think maybe industry might have a better sense of the best solutions rather than saying government has all the answers?
Sure. Yes.
Or neither necessarily knows?
Well, I think neither industry nor government knows at the outset what the government's going to need is, right? I think that's why there has to be an evolution in the government's requirements process. They don't know what the government's going to look like 3 years out. They don't know what the government's going to look like 5 years out. So how can we define
particularly in the IT space,
precisely.
Right?
Okay. So defining the requirements sort of as they grow and as they evolve is really important, and getting validated learning at an early stage is important for an agency.
So that's an interesting concept of growing the requirements, because sometimes GAO talks about some of the problems with IT acquisitions that have failed has been shifting those requirements midstream, but that's different than what you're talking about. What's the distinction there?
Totally. So there's a great concept in the digital space called YAGNI. And YAGNI is an acronym.
This is another great Dave acronym.
Sure. I wish I could claim that I invented them. They pre-exist me. And YAGNI is you ain't gonna need it. And it's the idea that there's so much premature optimization that exists. We think we're going to need something without any sort of evidence that we actually need it. So rather than saying we're going to need this thing without knowing that you're going to need it, Agile Agile procurement prioritizes actually validating that a user will need it and buying just that thing. So rather than changing your requirements midstream, what you're really trying to buy is the capacity. You're really trying to buy the methodology and making sure that you scale appropriate to the actual needs.
And I suppose scaling appropriately is better in that sort of short sprint approach, right?
Absolutely.
So you do it in increments, in short sprints, and then you can kind of build or change requirements as needed.
Yeah, exactly. So if we can focus every 2 weeks or every month and know what we're trying to get, we won't find ourselves 6 months or a year or 2 years into a project and say that's not what we need in the first place.
Got it. So what other kind of flexibilities can you build into an Agile IT contract?
Right. So this is actually really a challenging question, and one that we're still trying to learn a lot about. Part of the reason why is that we don't really have great data around what works best in Agile procurements. It's still early days. And one of the things I'm really sort of optimistic about is the Agile BPA that we're doing here at GSA and 18F. We're going to be looking at different ways to experiment in the Agile space, figure out what works and what doesn't work, and really try to get better, like I said, validated learning about how to do Agile IT. One of the things that we know is that Agile contracts promote the idea of transparency and accountability at an early stage. And so we know that vendors, if they're held accountable, but also know what they're expected to provide, will get us better results. And as I sort of alluded to before with the YAGNI principle, if we're focusing on what users actually needs, not just what the government says it needs, but how users actually interact with the software, we'll get vendors delivering more useful products.
How do you engage the users? And give me examples of sometimes how you might have a different audience or different set of users.
So users are at the fore of a lot of what we do at 18F. So we use a concept called user-centered design. And user-centered design requires you to bring in users on a regular basis and have them interact with the service. Sometimes this looks like structured exercises where you have them go find information on a particular site. Sometimes this is asking people just for their general reactions to pages. Do they like how it looks, or do they like how something else looks? So really trying to get users to interact with the page and having them explain their pain points, having them explain the process, actually watching them use a site gives us a lot of insight in terms of how they will use it down the road.
How do you find those users? I know it's sort of a silly question, but how do you advertise or recruit for people to come in and test and provide input?
This is actually one of the hardest parts in the government. We've had some really interesting experiences where I've had senior leaders in government say, well, what can I do to help you? And I'll say, find us users. Because if we don't have real users, if we don't have people who are interacting with it, we won't have great results. And so we really need to be trying to reach out and finding people, particularly if they're government employees, how do we incentivize them not to just say, well, this would actually harm my ability to do well in my job, but make it feel part of their mission, part of their job to come and interact with these sites. And we also use a staged approach at 18F, which is we have alpha and beta and production. So we never want to get into a situation where the first time that users are interacting with it is in a production site. We want to start with a small...
That's too far.
Exactly.
Too far in the process.
Exactly.
Right.
You want to start with a small group of users and then build over time. And hopefully, as you're going through the process, you can't see my hands on the podcast, but imagine you can see my hands moving from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, that you're trying to identify new users so that as you grow, you have more users interacting with the site. And then eventually, by the time that it's in production, you've had a great diversity of people interacting with the page.
How do you reach users who are members of the public versus government employees?
Right. So there are some, depending on the nature of the product, there are some challenges. Right. So one of the things that we have to be thoughtful of is the Paperwork Reduction Act. We have to be thoughtful about how we attract people to interact with the pages. And there are ways. They're essentially like almost like a playbook for how we're trying to do some of these things. And usually it's, putting out calls to action, asking people in the agency which stakeholders they know would be interested. I'm thinking of a recent project that we had where it involved people from industry, people from just on the street, people from Congress and elsewhere to interact with the page so that we can get a real range of opinions about how it would be useful.
Sounds like we could do a whole separate podcast on the sort of mechanics of that and working within government rules and requirements.
There's the usability testing.
And we don't do it that often.
Exactly. And it's a new concept, frankly, for the government. One of the great things about 18F is that there's a huge community of designers in addition to developers and user experience experts, so-called UX experts. And so that's what they really focus on, is how do we get users to interact with the digital services.
Another important topic is accountability, and how do we hold vendors accountable for performance?
Right. So Agile is one way, but it's not the only way. I think the hardest part is that we have to really be, if we're being honest with ourselves, we haven't been really great buyers, right? The government hasn't been the best buyer, particularly in the digital space, because we don't often know what we want. Sometimes we have a general sense of what we're trying to get, and we say, yeah, these are the things that we think that we need, but we're not really able to communicate with clear direction to the vendors what it is that we're trying to get. So I think the first thing is that we need to have a really clear sense of what we're trying to buy, and like I said, have a little bit of humility about knowing what we don't know. And then once we have a sense of what we're trying to drive to, then we need to set clear milestones, clear tasks, clear user stories, and prioritize working software over just about anything else. You need to have documentation for sure, but you need to make sure that you're complying with all the relevant rules. But if you don't have working software, you don't have anything. And so we really need to focus on setting clear goals and clear milestones and clear tasks, making sure that the vendors understand them, have bought into them, and then making sure that they deliver on them. And that communication happens both ways. The vendors have to be able to feel comfortable talking to the government, and the government has to feel comfortable talking to the vendor community.
I have heard from some companies really describe in practical terms how important the communication piece is. And one company was describing that with one agency there was a meeting of senior leadership like every few weeks. And it was a great forum to kind of flag any upcoming problems or issues. But in another agency there was very little communication, and at some point, many months into the project, they got called into the leadership's office and just given a litany of issues that were really problematic, and they thought if you had just communicated this to us early and more frequently, we would have been able to address this.
Totally. I describe this sometimes in the Agile BPA as we need to really focus on service delivery in two dimensions, right? We need to be focusing on service delivery not just to our customer agencies, but also to be focused on the vendor community, because ultimately we're buying, and we want to make sure that our vendors want to sell to us, and that we're communicating to them, and they view us as partners, and we view them as partners as well. And that is, I think, really key, because if we don't have a good relationship with our vendor community, we're certainly not going to be able to deliver good quality service to partner agencies. So that communication has to go in two directions, and it's really key to making sure that this works.
I agree. So let me ask you one final question about open source. So briefly describe to me in your words what open source means, and then why, from your perspective, what is the sort of best open source solution out there?
Sure. So open source is actually a cluster of concepts around the idea that people should be able to see your work and also be able to use your work without additional permission. And what that means is that there are usually licenses associated with open source software, and there's a range of permissiveness in terms of the licenses. But in general, you should be able to see how software works. And if you want to use it or change it or do something with that software, you have the permission to do it. 18F is an open source shop. We will always use an open source solution unless there's an alternative that compels us to use a non-open source solution. And we work in the open. So this means that from day one of our projects, we're committing our source code to the public domain and on a public platform that anyone in the world could see what we're doing. And we've seen that that's had a lot of benefits for us. It helps us get public input in terms of how we're doing things. We've actually had members of the public who had no affiliation with government, no affiliation with anything that we're doing, submit what are called pull requests as ways to improve our software and make it better. Open source has benefits beyond just the development. It also ensures from a procurement standpoint, we're avoiding vendor lock-in. We're making sure that we're not stuck with one vendor when that vendor disappears or when that vendor decides that that vendor doesn't want to do business with the government anymore. And it can even, this sounds a little bit wacky, but sometimes it can even avoid procurements, right? If there's an open source solution that's out there and you can just use it, why do you have to go to market? And so those are some of the reasons that we prefer and promote open source within government. And we're not the first agency to do it. It's been around for a long time, but it's really starting to catch on.
Thank you, Dave, for sharing your perspective from that of a developer and a lawyer. And we really welcome experience from the entire acquisition workforce, because good procurement is bigger than just the contracting shop. It's inclusive of the experiences and stories from the general counsels to the technologists and other key personnel. So for everyone listening, we want to hear and share your story to increase awareness and adoption of best practices. Share your experiences and learn from your peers by visiting buyersclub.ideascale.com and clicking TechFAR Hub use cases. Access curated expertise, prices paid data, and contract vehicles for categorized goods and services by visiting the Acquisition Gateway at hallways.cap.gsa.gov. As always, thanks so much for tuning in, and listen for us next time, where we'll continue to take you behind the buy.